To do my introduction on time. Very brief as usual. L.A.S.E.R stands for Leonardo Art Science Evening Rendezvous. If you're not familiar with it, go to lasertalks.com. Today we have these lunchtime presentations on Zoom, and then if you're in the Bay Area, in the evening we have 3 more talks in person. So I will introduce John and Sarah one by one. If you go to lasertalks.com, you will also find extensive long bios of the speakers and a link to their webpage. Introduction for Sarah. Sarah Cole is Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Dean of the School of Arts at Columbia University. She's a specialist in modernism, and she has published at least books that I know of. The latest on H.G. Wells. What's the title? Invented Tomorrow. And today we talk about Mrs. Dalloway. It's 100 years of the publication of this novel. So I'll let Sarah do the introduction. Then I have questions, and anybody in the audience is welcome to post additional questions in the chat. I'm going to kill my video to give you maximum bandwidth and to avoid these technical glitches. And I'm asking John to do the same thing. Just kill the video. Okay, all yours, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you, Piero. Thank you, L.A.S.E.R friends, for being here. It's hard to have a presentation of just me talking about a book after that visual feast. So, but it's a gear switch. I will just add that though I'm coming to you from New York City, where I live and teach, I did grow up in the Bay Area, and I grew up in Berkeley. So seeing all those images of places like San Pablo Avenue was very stimulating. However, we're going to talk about something else today. So as Piero said, I am here to talk with you about Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf's novel, which is having its 100th birthday this year. It was published in 1925. And I will say that it has been a pleasure for me, with this anniversary upon us, to spend some time thinking about Mrs. Dalloway, which is one of the great novels of the 20th century, in my opinion, and always warrants a reread. I don't know if the audience here has read Mrs. Dalloway. When I talk about it, I'll try to give sort of cues, and happy, of course, in the Q&A to talk about any level of detail about Woolf or the novel that you'd like. So as I say, it's the 100th anniversary. This was Virginia Woolf's 4th novel. And really, it's the one that stands as her breakout novel in terms of form and style, and the kind of formal elements that have become very famous as her signature achievement, or one of her signature achievements. She's considered a modernist, which means very different things to people in different fields, but in literary studies, it refers to this group of writers, of which Woolf is in some ways one of the most, if not the most widely read today, who believed in this, at this moment in the early 20th century, that novelistic form or literary form in different ways needed to change. They were interested in kind of breaking up some of the traditions and expectations that had grounded the novel for the previous 100+ years. And so the experiments in form for which Woolf became famous really take off here in Mrs. Dalloway. The novels have a tendency, including this one, to plunge into one given character's mind. There is no, there actually is a narration, but you don't have a narrator in the sense that one is perhaps accustomed to with a novel by Jane Austen, for example, who will speak directly to you and guide you through and always be there as a kind of recognizable figure. So the narration, some people call this stream of consciousness. That was not a word that Woolf used about her own fiction, but it's helpful in giving us a sense of how the attention of the reader is kind of moved from place to place in a kind of stream-like motion. narratives leap from past to present. You're not always sure where you are, where you're standing. There's a feeling of the rug being pulled out from underneath you. Woolf has very famously, wonderfully long sentences. They interrupt themselves. As I tell my students, hang in there. You will always get back to the place where you're supposed to be, but they'll have multiple parentheticals. She has an ability to write just absolutely spellbinding, arresting, memorable novels in which not really that much happens. So these are all features of Woolf's books from here on out. So this novel was followed almost immediately by To the Lighthouse, which is probably equally her most widely read novel. There's The Waves, Between the Acts, a number of others that come after Mrs. Dalloway, where we see Woolf at the height of her genius. It is a novel that is, to me, exuberant, not only in its themes, and I'll talk in a minute about its energies and its kind of joys, but it's also exuberant, I want to say, about its own form and its own accomplishment. And so when we hear Clarissa thinking in the sort of second paragraph of the novel, what a lark, what a plunge, it also seems to be describing the novel itself. And there are lots of ways in which the novel keeps pointing to its own, or using metaphors or different kinds of languages to kind of suggest its own mechanisms and its own project. So the novel is very much enthusiastic about what it's doing. I don't mean to say it's a lighthearted novel, it's not, but there is a sense of kind of joy in its own accomplishments and its own mechanism. It is, Mrs. Dalloway is, in my opinion, Virginia Woolf's most philosophical novel. And maybe I'll say a few things in a little bit further along about what I mean by that. But, her next novel, To the Lighthouse, has lots of philosophers in it. So it's not peopled by individuals who are professional philosophers. But it is a very philosophical novel. It's deeply interested in big questions about time and mortality and death. Another way to say this is to think that, to note that the stakes are very high for everything. You're doing something like following someone as he crosses the street and sees a car. And out of that experience, or out of that short motion, we are able to kind of dig into some of the biggest and deepest and most troubling and most interesting questions in human experience. So there is that quality of philosophical depth and philosophical inquiry that make this novel, that accompany all aspects of this novel. I should say that the novel takes place over one day. It's a day novel, if that's a thing that you're interested in. It takes place over one day in June of 1923. It was written, as I said, and published in 25, so 2 years later. And I always feel that setting it in that year of 23 is very important. It's exactly 5 years since the end of World War I. This is, in my reading, very much a war novel, and I can say some more about that in my remarks and in Q&A if you'd like. So it's a novel that takes place over the course of one day. That's something that was out and about as an idea in this period. Many of you may be familiar with Ulysses, James Joyce's novel of 1922, which also takes place over the course of one day. In that case, it's Dublin, here it's London, and there are some ways in which these two books are in conversation with each other. So it takes place in this very present moment of 1923 in London in the summer, but it also is a novel of memory. And so the novel will continually revert back to a variety of different times in the past. That's something all novels do in a way, through memory or back narration or flashbacks or lots of other things that many different narrative mediums do. The way it happens to work out in Mrs. Dalloway is you're just suddenly like in the past. So we don't always have, again, that kind of guiding hand to kind of help us figure out where we are. But in particular, there's a summer 33 years earlier that Clarissa Dalloway, the protagonist, and Peter Walsh, her sort of former friend and lover, who's back, not lover, but like would-be husband from that earlier period. He's back in London, and the two of them, in their different thought processes, keep going back to this summer 33 years earlier, when a lot of consequential things were happening with this group of young people. So there is one time frame, but there is a kind of past as well. I often think about the fact that it's that moment that keeps coming back. I mean, it's a novel that many people think of as being kind of permeated by the past, which it is, but it's very controlled. We don't hear most things that happened to Clarissa Dalloway or Peter Walsh over the intervening 3 decades. We hear nothing about the birth of her daughter or her marriage or her life. So the past is there, but it's there in a very specific way. There are a lot of frames that we might use or point to, or comparisons to think about situating Mrs. Dalloway in the moment of its publication or in literary history. I won't go into a lot of those, but I already mentioned Ulysses. Many readers think of Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, as a kind of feminist London response to Joyce's Ulysses. Certainly, she's thinking about that. Even more direct in my own reading is her response to T.S. Eliot's great poem, The Wasteland, which the Woolfs, who had a printing press, the Hogarth Press, published, and she knew Eliot very well. And I see she opens with flowers in June, and The Wasteland opens with lilacs in April. And there are just a lot of ways in which these kinds of modernist diagnostics of their post-war world are in a kind of interesting, rich relation to one another. Heart of Darkness makes a cameo. Many people think that Clarissa Dalloway is best read as a kind of updating of Richardson's famous novel Clarissa, which some novel critics think of as kind of inauguration of the modern novel. So there's a kind of 19th century novelistic history that's getting picked up. It's a city novel, as I've mentioned, and in that sense, I think, and there's a lot of mostly what people are doing for most of the novel is kind of walking around the city. And that taps into a lot of different traditions of city writing, whether they're kind of French 19th century flaneurs, where the poets and others walk through the city of Paris, or whether it's Proust, who was a big influence on Woolf, or whether it's a more kind of gritty urban type of novel that Woolf was also very familiar with, Dickens or others in the 19th century. Many of the works that Woolf was very interested in are kind of big, long, comprehensive novels that have a way of sort of trying to capture a community or a culture or a nation. Think of something like War and Peace. She loved Tolstoy, don't we all? And so I see Mrs. Dalloway in that tradition as well, as a kind of what came to be called a condition of England novel, which is to say a novel that kind of attempts to capture its moment and its society and its people. So there are a lot of different ways that we can think about this. When I teach Mrs. Dalloway, I usually have 3 hour-and-a-half long lectures. So that's 4.5 hours of lecturing plus a lot of other stuff. And I still don't get there. So we don't have time like that. So what I thought I would do is just to mention a couple more things about the novel that you might find interesting. And since it's the 100th year anniversary, to talk a little bit about why I love this novel so much and why I think it remains so powerful 100 years later. So I'll just mention 4 things, but let me just say, in thinking about this anniversary, it has really seemed, there are kind of different ways that you can think about things that are around 100 years old. One is they're like really old, like kind of World War I, which is a scholarly specialty of mine, kind of feels like that. Like, did that ever happen? Sometimes things from some part of the past feel like they very much, they're such a part of your world, you can't imagine life without them. Or they might still feel just shockingly, bracingly new. And for me, Mrs. Dalloway sort of, it occupies both of those second things. It is, on the one hand, impossible for me to sort of move my way around the world without Virginia Woolf somehow accompanying me. And I feel that she speaks so much to me and to our students. I mean, I read graduate applications, and I will tell you that still Mrs. Dalloway is Virginia Woolf is by far the most common source of students writing samples if they're applying to PhD programs to work on modernism. So she's still very much speaking to young people as well. I don't count myself as a young person, but to them. And at the same time, every time I read it, I'm sort of reminded again of how hard it is and how brilliant it is and how different it is. I notice different things every time I read it. So I think it speaks to us. It's helped to form literary culture in so many ways. And at the same time, it still seems new. So let me just mention 4 quick things. I have about 5 or so minutes left before we do Q&A. So let me just rattle through 4 things that I particularly love about this novel that I haven't maybe already mentioned so much. The first one is that the novel is so full of joy and exuberance. It is in love with life very early on. I have a passage I was going to just read to you. This is Clarissa herself. She has, if you know the famous first line, Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. It's a shopping expedition, among other things. Everybody's out and about. A lot of people are shopping, by the way. It's a very commercial scene in London. And here's what she thinks. This is Mrs. Dalloway's thinking, Clarissa Dalloway's thinking. In people's eyes, she says that you can't control people by acts of parliament because they just are there. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwichmen shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, and the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some airplane overhead was what she loved. Life, London, this moment in June. And the novel is like that all throughout. It is full of the energy and of the joy and of the possibility of being in London, a city where people are moving across unfamiliar spaces and familiar spaces, seeing old friends, seeing complete strangers. There's a lot to be said about the space of London, which I think of as a kind of metaphysical city in so many ways. So it's a novel that passes on that exuberance to its reader and invites us in. Second, and in partial contradiction to this, despite this kind of whoosh and swoop and ride, like the airplane overhead, and there's a wonderful sequence with an airplane to which the narrative alluded just there in case you noticed it. Related to all of that and inseparable from it is the tragedy and the seriousness of life and of the world. It is a novel about healing, recovering from the gigantic disaster and tragedy of World War I. There are a lot of doctors who are not doing their job. In fact, they're kind of the villains of the piece. There's so much need for healing. There's a very powerful and heart-wrenching suicide towards the end of the novel. And that was always part of the conception for Woolf, was to, as she said, think about sanity and insanity side by side, but you also might think of it as life and death. And there's a wonderful moment, I mean, wonderful and serious late in the novel. The novel ends at a party and Clarissa Dalloway thinks, oh, they were speaking about Septimus, the young man who killed himself. And she thinks, oh, here's death at my party. And that seems like such a wonderful line for all of us, you know, when there are the moments when you're bringing together and you feel that life is at its most saturated and affirming, and here's death. So it's a very serious novel that at the same time, and this is true about the war as well. I love that. I guess a third thing I would say is that I read this as a war novel. I teach war novels. I'm very interested in the representation of war from the early 20th century to the present. And the particular way in which this community is recovering and not recovering seems exceptionally powerful and brilliant. And there's a reason why so many readers return to this novel when they're thinking about other kinds of war tragedies and how the society does and doesn't move on from it. I guess 2 more things I would just say about why I think this novel is so wonderful and why I think it's still so powerful for readers. One is that, the other one is that it's a social novel. All novels are social novels in some sense, but it is a novel that is extremely generous with its sociality, by which I mean, even though there are a couple of primary characters, the narrative drops into many, many different people's minds over the course of the day, people who will appear for one paragraph and never appear again, people across the social spectrum, not all the way across, not like from the very highest to the very lowest, but a very broad spectrum of the social body. And it's a social novel because it's thinking deeply about what it means to be a collective, what it means to be a person, an individual, and how these things go together and how these things interlock. So there's and as I said, the novel ends with a party, and that's very, very important. It's a moment of bringing people together. Clarissa is kind of, insulted or sort of mocked for being the perfect hostess and for caring too much about her parties. And it's sort of like, nobody wants this party. Why do you have to have their parties? But the novel believes in bringing people together in this way. And as it happens, many of the characters from 33 years earlier, many of whom Clarissa hasn't seen for many years, are there at the party. And so there's a kind of literary sort of resolution in having these people together. But more, I think it's Woolf kind of insisting that as much as the novel dramatizes a kind of deep aloneness in your own private psyche and the terrible tragedy of that in the case of Septimus Warren Smith, who is the shell-shocked soldier who kills himself. Nevertheless, there's something incredibly important about the bringing of people together. So those are some of the things that I really love about the novel and that I think have helped to sustain it over the years. We could talk about the particular characters. We could talk about, what does and doesn't happen, about the way she represents mental illness, the way she represents medicine, the way she represents empire. These are all aspects of the novel that are very important. And I guess the last thing I would just want to point you to is its reflections on time. It's a novel that once you pick a novel that you're going to set in one day, you're already sort of setting yourself up to be very interested in how time works. But in very many ways, it's a novel about the temporality of the city and of the day, but also of the lifespan. And there's just a lot of reflection about aging and about youth, but also about the experience of time in the moment and its particular violences and also its particular affordances. So I think I should stop there so that we can have time for Q&A. I'm looking at my chat. That looks like it's from the last one.
Oh, you're good. You're good. Excellent. Yeah. I was taking notes like crazy.
Good.
You covered some of the things I wanted to ask you, like the friendship with the T.S. Eliot. I don't think it's well known. It's interesting when you mentioned flowers in June. I never made the connection. Anyway, let's start with with Joyce actually, because people place Woolf and Joyce in the same category, right?
Yes.
But one thing which should tell people if they haven't read the novels, I mean, Mrs. Dalloway is a brief novel compared with Ulysses.
That's true.
Right, and also the way it plays with language, I think it's actually easier. It's interesting you said it's a philosophical novel. I tend to think of Virginia Woolf as a poetic writer, but then yeah, it's also a philosophical novel. Anyway, the one difference that I noticed between Ulysses and Mrs. Dalloway is what you were mentioning about World War One. You read Ulysses written during the war, and the war doesn't exist. And in Woolf, instead, there is the war. In fact, Septimus, you mentioned, commits suicide, presumably because of the trauma of the war. Clarissa herself, if I'm not mistaken, she's recovering from the flu. And the novel doesn't mention the Spanish flu, but, it comes natural to us, COVID generation, to think that's a Spanish flu. So it's pretty much the one big difference is that Mrs. Dalloway is really there. The historical context is when it was written, and in Ulysses, I don't see that. Would you agree with that?
So there's a lot to say. I love Ulysses. It's one of my favorite books to teach. As you say, it's a lot longer. It's a lot more difficult. When I teach Ulysses, we spend 2 months on it. When I teach Mrs. Dalloway, we spend a week and a half. So it is a completely different kind of experience. And for your readers who have not encountered it, usually it's something you have a guidebook along the way. You need a lot of props and help. So there are a lot of, and they're just, the differences are many more than the similarities. I think the question of contemporaneity is an interesting one. As some people will know, Ulysses, which involves the one day in the life of a half Jewish man in Dublin named Leopold Bloom. He's the Ulysses of the title, or Odysseus, to give him his Greek name. And it has this kind of Homeric superstructure. So each chapter is connected to an episode in the Odyssey, and characters in the novel are connected to characters in the Homeric myths, and so forth. At the same time, Ulysses is completely absorbed in its actual moment. And Joyce went to huge lengths to make sure he had the exact right date when such and such a play was on, in this theater in central Dublin. Or he's rumored, and I believe this is true because I remember reading some of the primary sources about this, if you drops a piece of paper in the Liffey to time exactly how long it would take to get to the other place where the character is going to find it. So that's a book that is hyper attentive to the sort of specifics of the moment, the place. There are lots and lots of real characters in it. And at the same time is very kind of flamboyant about having a kind of archetypal or mythic structure. I would say Mrs. Dalloway is doing both of those things LITE. You could say that there are sort of quest structures in the novel. There's more of that, frankly, into the Lighthouse. Some people read certain passages as a trip to the underworld, and sort of her picking up on these epic structures. And at the same time, being also, so it's there, but not in anywhere near the kind of consciousness or self-promotion that you find it in Ulysses. And at the same time, in terms of the sort of specifics of the world of now, you're absolutely right that its attentiveness to its time in 1923 is very marked, and particularly with the war. And not only with the war, but sort of like, how exactly are people moving on? The war is over, thank heaven, over, except for someone like so-and-so. And then immediately we're back into the present of people coping with loss. So I think there are, they're both very committed to finding representational modes to make sense of time in its bigger and its smaller and its very personal and its very shared characteristics. And at the same time, they just do these things quite differently. And Woolf, just for the record, was ambivalent about Ulysses. She saw it as the great work that would define the modern era, but she was not so keen on its, as she thought, its vulgarity, the very opening, Leopold Bloom is on the toilet or whatever, the outhouse, and she didn't care for all that stuff. And she felt there was a little bit more like smashing and crashing, as she says, than she needed. And at the same time, as I say, she was a huge part of this movement, of which Joyce also was one, and a huge believer in its ultimate importance.
You have a question? Did you see it? Otherwise, I have another question.
I see it. It's a great question. I can't.
Can you say the question?
Sorry. Do you see Woolf influencing much later impressionists in quotation marks, such as John Hawkes? I can't speak to that particular example. I do think that Woolf has been extremely influential in just about all over the world. And, but it's not, I think, as Piero mentioned, I'm the very proud and happy and privileged to be the Dean of a School of the Arts. We have a large creative writing program. So I think a lot about young writers who are studying and making their own way into the world of writing. And, some of these great figures almost have to be kind of like, you need a shade up between you and them. And I think it can feel daunting to have someone like Woolf in your or Joyce in that for that matter. But as far as sort of her own, what she influenced by, you mentioned somebody here, the same writer, was she perhaps influenced by Ford Madox Ford? Yeah, Ford Madox Ford is one of these underappreciated modernists who I guarantee you that none of my students have heard of. But when I was in college, 40 years ago, whatever that was, we read a lot of Ford Madox Ford, and that was partly because he was, very, he and Conrad were very close and collaborated and so on. And he was also someone who did, in a novel like The Good Soldier, was a very sort of innovative, formerly innovative writer and was influential in that way. But the other thing about Maddox Ford is that he was a kind of, what's the right word? He was a person who wanted to sort of get the word out about modernism. And so he was a networker and a connector, and he was a sort of believer in the modernist movements and a supporter of modernist writers. So in that sense, Ford is a bigger kind of figure in this culture and community than he's sometimes remembered to be. So he's very much in the mix, even though, as I say, he's not so widely read today, which I think is a shame because his books remain very weird and complicated and problematic and interesting, which is what we like in novels.
Just changing topic, I want to make sure we don't miss this aspect, mental illness. I find that mental illness is throughout her novels comes up, not as the main topic, but I mean, Septimus commits suicide. And for those who don't know, Virginia Woolf committed suicide and had her own problems, right?
Yes. Yes, I mean, it's a heartbreaking novel. And I was thinking at one point, but I didn't have time and I didn't think it was maybe fair to our guests here. I was going to read the passage when Septimus kills himself. He sits on the rail, on the windowsill, and he thinks the sun is hot and life is good. And why does human nature have to be so awful? And he throws himself off. And just the pathos of that moment of his just enjoying the heat of the sun, which has been a refrain in the novel, Fear no more the heat of the sun. Clarissa is thinking about a page from Shakespeare she saw in a bookshop window. Clarissa and Septimus are kind of pairs throughout the novel. And if you read it, you'll see all the ways in which, though they have nothing to do with each other, would never meet and have anything actually, would have no actual connections. From a literary point of view, they're kind of parallels throughout the novel. And then after she hears about his death, she goes into a room, she walks out of her party into a kind of quiet room and she experiences it. And so there's literary, readers have debated for 100 years what to make of that. Gesture. Is it a kind of unbelievable empathy on her part, or is it a kind of appropriating of his suffering for her pleasure and everything in between? But the point is that Virginia Woolf always envisioned there to be mental illness at the center of this novel. Originally, it was going to be a short story about Clarissa Dalloway, and she was going to be the one who committed suicide, and eventually it took the shape that it took. And then Septimus was added. And in her, there's a famous diary entry where she talks about a novel which would put sanity and insanity, I think I mentioned this earlier, side by side. Those are her terms. Those who have spent a lot of time reading Virginia Woolf or learning about her life will know, as you say, that she herself suffered from mental illness on and off throughout her life and attempted suicide before she ultimately did commit suicide. And so there is a quality of autobiography, or let's just say kind of personal, intimate understanding that is very powerful here. That said, Septimus's ravings are kind of unintelligible. He's a character that including me, people love to love, but he is very sick. He's not treated properly by these doctors who are terrible in a lot of ways. And so he's not given the help that he needs. So it's a really powerful novel about that. His particular illness comes from his experience in the war. And so that whole question of sort of war trauma, what was at the time called shell shock, is something that's very much on people's minds, including Woolf's. But it does have this very personal quality. And I think it's a lot of people recognize it's very interesting that this was something that was shared, that was kind of sent over to Septimus from Clarissa. And so there's a kind of attenuation perhaps from Woolf herself, but a very important aspect of this and others, as you say, of Woolf's novels.
If you have more time, two last questions, moving towards science a little bit. You mentioned that time is a big,
yes.
I think it's almost a co-protagonist of this novel. And if I'm not mistaken, the novel was supposed to be titled The Hours, right?
Yes. That was the working title when she was writing it. Yeah.
And I still remember that in the middle of the novel, exactly page whatever, the middle of the novel, the Big Ben strikes noon, right? And there's all these clocks that keep coming up. So, and then you said it's philosophical novel. Philosophers at the time were discussing a lot about time, right?
Yes,
I don't know, in France, Bergson, and so.
correct.
So do you think that she did it intentionally to have this emphasis on time, or just came natural to somebody who writes in the stream of consciousness style?
Oh, I think it's very intentional. The clocks you mentioned repeat, are mentioned repeatedly over the course of the novel. One of the funny things and interesting things I learned from reading this novel about London is that they're all sort of chiming at different times. It's not like at the exact hour, all the clocks of London start to chime. They're on their own schedules. So there's this kind of, on the one hand, a kind of standardization of time, and on the other hand, a kind of idiosyncrasy of time. And, Woolf is, as you say, there are philosophers like Bergson who are thinking about time. The Greenwich Mean Time was established in 1884, and there's a sort of view of modern temporality and time as being guided by sort of imperial and capitalist principles of synchronicity. This is how the world has to work. Everybody has to get onto the same time so that the trains can run, so that the commodities can trade, and so on and so forth. And so there's a way in which Woolf and Joyce too. Joyce is very interested in time and has a whole bunch of other things going on there as well, along similar lines. And I think that so Woolf is interested in time as something that is experienced and something that is kind of regulated, as something that is private and as something that is shared, as something that we experience as that is thought of as universal, but in fact, science is starting to show as early as this period when the book was being written as actually operating according to all kinds of unintuitive principles. So I do think that this is a topic on which she was very, very interested. And again, she's not alone. There's The Magic Mountain is roughly, Thomas Mann's great novel is roughly contemporaneous with this. And that's another one that is fascinating on time, on the issue of time. Yes, she knew Sassoon.
Okay.
Sassoon. Some people feel that Septimus Warren Smith is modeled in part on Siegfried Sassoon, partly because of their names, and they're not really alike, actually. But that's, she was a kind of a patroness in a way to these war writers. I don't think Sassoon was published in the Hogarth press, but other war writers were. So she was, herself as a sort of established writer was very generous towards some of these younger figures, including some of the war writers. So yeah, I think we're
Okay.
over
So,
over time.
no. My final question, which I now am rephrasing, is a provocative thought.
Okay.
So she was friend with Bertrand Russell. I'm not sure if she was already friend at that time or later. And but so the philosophy apart. So Bertrand Russell is somebody who knew a lot about the science of the time. But let me start from the science point of view. So she lived when quantum mechanics was invented. Einstein, 1905 is the special relativity, 1915 is the general relativity. The Rutherford model of the atom, I don't know the year, but it's right there. And then Hubble's discovery that the universe is expanding. The wave particle duality. I don't know if she was aware of these things when she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, but there was all this science going on. Now, a lot of people in the humanities actually tend to think, oh, was the writer influenced by the science that was happening? My provocative thought is, could it be the other way around, where writers like Virginia Woolf and James Joyce and painters like the Cubist and so on, is it possible that they influence not so much the scientific discovery, but the acceptance of science? Because that crazy science that is emerging in the first 20 years of the 20th century eventually gets accepted. We accepted that time is something very strange that can shrink and dilate. We accept that strange things happen in space. We accept that there are atoms, and we accept that that waves and particles are the same thing. By the way, one of Woolf's my favorite novels is titled Waves, and I don't know if it's a
Yeah,
coincidence.
and she had been reading physicists, James Jeans and those people when she wrote that.
Reading who?
Is James Jeans, yes, he's a physicist, a wave
Oh, he was a
physicist.
scientist. The
Yes,
scientist. Okay.
scientist, yeah.
So is it possible that actually these writers, maybe they were influenced by the science that was emerging? Again, I don't know how much they read about the scientific papers, but is it possible that the science eventually was accepted precisely because the writers were doing their own little revolution, the artists in general, they were going through their own little revolution, that changed our perception of time, our perception of matter. And then it became sort of natural to accept, yes, relatively sounds like a crazy, but actually our mindset has been prepared to change our view of the universe. What do you think?
I love that idea. As an arts person, that works for me. Yeah, I think these things happen as part of a shared intellectual and cultural milieu. And this period in particular was one of a great deal of cross sort of fertilization among the arts, but across the arts with the sciences. I mean, we all teach in universities that call themselves the arts and sciences, and these things were all founded on an idea that these were shared spheres. I don't know, I'm not a historian of science that can tell you when or why relativity became accepted or any other theory, but I do believe that the revolutions that happened in the arts, not only in literature, played a part in the mental landscape of people who were reading and writing and thinking and going to universities. I did write a book on H.G. Wells, and I'm teaching Wells right now, so I cannot help but just point out that if you read Richard Rhodes' book about the invention of the atom bomb, he begins in his preface with Leo Szilard reading H.G. Wells's book of 1914, The World Set Free, when he invented atomic explosion, and taking that as a kind of inspiration in different ways. So there are a lot of ways in which artists are out there and the scientists are learning, and of course the other way around.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you
you,
so
John, if
much.
you're still there, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you for your time. Thank
Take
you,
care.
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.